Aliceville, Alabama, June 2, 1943. Dawn floats over the Frisco Depot at Aliceville, Alabama. June 2, 1943. Magnolia scent riding the humidity. The train brakes sigh. Doors clatter. Gray uniforms pour out beneath towers, where Browning M1919s crouch like iron locusts. The townspeople stand 3 deep, hats in hand, not jeering, watching. A Red Cross nurse fixes her cap. A whistle slices the cicadas, and the column steps off to cadence, boots crunching cinders. Private First Class Eddie Morales, 711th MP Escort Guard Company, thumbs the action on his M1 Garand, semi-automatic, .3006, 8-round en-bloc clip, then counts heads with a sergeant's nod. Inside the wire, Camp Aliceville runs to compass and square, barracks, mess, infirmary, library, double fences with fresh staples glinting like fish scales. Floodlights stare even in daylight, daring night to try. The Geneva Convention reads here like a checklist: medical intake, hot food, delousing, showers that steam the concrete. Gefreiter Karl Weiss blinks at the neatness, at the magnolias beyond the wire, at an MP who says "sir" to a civilian. He had expected a mob. He receives a metal tray, a tin cup, an orderly "next." He eats white bread for the first time since Africa and studies the crumb as if it held a code. He would have expected blackouts, shortages, the paranoia of a besieged land. Instead, the depot is intact, the rails glossy, the sky unscarred by searchlights. Guards talk about schedules and ball scores. A noon whistle blows somewhere in town, and a dozen dogs answer. Karl tries to imagine the Reich describing this scene to him and cannot. The gate closes with a rehearsed clank. The cicadas resume. Karl taps the bread crust once, lightly, and thinks, "This does not look like an enemy's land." The smell of cut grass and coal smoke hangs over everything, ordinary and overwhelming at once. Late 1943, transit west. The night yard glows sodium orange as lanterns bob like fireflies between boxcars. Orders pinwheel from clipboards to whistles to couplers, and a westbound draft assembles behind a black locomotive breathing coal and certainty. Eddie rides the caboose step, boots slick with steel dust, and reviews the movement packet. Destination Kansas, purpose, harvest augmentation, escort, 1 squad, rotating watches. He checks the water cans lashed under the railcar bench, 5-gallon, wide mouth, copied from a German design the Americans improved, then racks his M1 Garand in a scabbard and notes the head count again. Discipline is rhythm. Rhythm keeps men from trying fences. Karl sits in a Pullman seat he would have called luxurious a year ago, knees against a duffel, staring at the reflection of his own tired face in a window that shows nothing of war. The conductor says they will make the planes in 2 days if the bridges stay clear. In Germany, he thinks, that sentence would have required hope and prayer. Here it is, logistics. A guard jokes that the timetable runs on time precisely because the Nazis did not plan it, and even Karl smiles at the bitter geometry of the line. He would have expected jeers at rural stops. He receives glances and a coffee poured by a woman who could be his aunt. In the mess car, a sergeant folds a newspaper. Another Liberty ship joins the convoy columns. One more hull in a procession that already numbers 2,710. The SS Robert E. Peary, the paper says, was once assembled in 4 days and some odd hours, an American dare to time itself. Eddie underlines the figure in pencil. Karl notes the part about ships returning with prisoners in spare berths. The ocean itself become a conveyor belt. The train slides past a river lit with moon shards. No blackout curtains, no sirens, only rails, shining, vanishing west. Summer 1944, Kansas harvest, Camp Concordia branch. The noon whistle lifts out of the wheat like a hawk and settles on the farmhouse roof. Heat smears the horizon, cut straw prickles the air. Martha Ellison wipes her hands on her apron and opens the screen door to the yard where 8 prisoners stand with their hats in their palms, watched by Eddie and his men in dusty HBT fatigues. "Inside," she says, feeling her mother's voice in her own, and gestures toward the long table already sweating pitchers of water and coffee. The men hesitate, looking to the corporal. Eddie nods. Discipline can walk on dignity. Chairs scrape, tinware clicks, bowls of beef stew steam beside white bread, thick butter, and a dish of canned peaches that catches the sun like stained glass. A John Deere waits outside with its flywheel ticking down, the smell of hot oil mixing with coffee. Carl sits last and whispers Danka without thinking. He would have expected rations by the back step and a guard barking hurry. Instead, Martha asks if anyone takes sugar. Several do not know the word. Eddie leans his M1 in the doorway and counts spoons, scanning habit more than threat. He has learned that a kind word saves an hour. Martha ladles seconds and mentions the county agent's circulars, the cannery's night shifts, the trains that never seem to stop. Carl listens as if to a weather report from another planet. Back home, mothers dice turnips into coffee. Here, the radio says a single factory, Willow Run, rolls a B-24 Liberator off the line every hour. He cannot fit the number into his skull. America, he realizes, fights with machines and with manners. When the bowls are empty, Martha wraps 2 heel ends of bread for the hogs. Carl watches the gesture like a sermon. "In Germany," he says softly, "we would save the paper." Kansas, late summer, 1944. The county agent lays his charts on Martha's kitchen table, pencil-tapping circles around acreage, yields, man-hours, the paper faintly scented with coffee. He explains what the Extension Service circulars already hinted. Assign POW details to the pea vinery at dawn, rotate to wheat stubble by 10, back to the cannery for the night shift. It isn't improvisation, it's a choreography, and courtesy is part of the drill. Church ladies would have scheduled sandwiches to meet the guard truck. The Red Cross would have packed thermoses. Eddie scans the plan, slotting his squad in 4-hour shifts, knowing a kind word keeps a watchtower quiet. Outside, a John Deere ticks down, flywheel breathing heat. The combine sickle bar whispers through barley, chaff floating like gold confetti. The elevator boss phones to warn the spur will bottleneck at noon. Eddie radios the depot for another boxcar, learns it's already rolling. This is how the country thinks: anticipate, dispatch, absorb, never panic. Martha ladles out stew, notes who takes sugar, watches shoulders drop as calories do their quiet work. She would have held firm to the rule book: no cakes, no handshakes, no names. Yet she hears the way please moves men faster than move. Carl stacks crates at the vinery, the air sweet with peas and machine oil. He notes the order of things: guards at ease, clipboards stamped, hoses coiled, everything clean enough to be inspected. Back home, he thinks, a broken belt would have stopped the line for days. Here, a spare hangs on a nail. He would have believed kindness meant weakness. Today, it behaves like a tool, another implement, like a wrench or a combine. When the whistle sounds, the crew files to the truck. The agent folds his charts. "Bring this in," he says, "and our boys eat white bread all winter." Carl stands at the fence in the blue hour, bats stitching the air, a radio in the guard shack leaking trumpet and snare like distant weather. He would have written that American food tasted like propaganda if not for the peaches still on his tongue. A sergeant, easy on his heels, mentions an airfield out east where P-51 Mustangs now escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Carl asks how many. The man shrugs, says, "Enough," then adds a number so large it sounds like a punchline. By war's end, hundreds of thousands of American aircraft will have rolled off the lines, a nation whittling the sky into tools. He tries to right the compass in his head. In Africa, he watched mechanics nurse a single truck through 3 campaigns. Here, Eddie's depot swaps a transmission before lunch and returns the vehicle to the road with a grease pencil smile on the windshield. The MP's rifles, M1 Garands, speak a different language than his Carabiner 98K. Semi-automatic, 8 quick shots, the very rhythm of American manufacturing built into the trigger. Carl counts the cadence in his imagination, thump, 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 and thinks of how it explains so much. A freight clatters past, grain sighing through the hopper gates into a river of bread. He knows his mother still splits her ration stamps with a neighbor and boils chicory for coffee. The contrast is so stark, it feels indecent. He would have written that Americans hoard, but he's watched Martha wrap leftovers for hogs, not hide them. Waste here is not neglect. It is capacity overflowing. The radio shifts to swing, then to headlines. The announcer says another convoy docked safely. Warehouses will spill open in the morning. Carl leans his forehead to the wire. He cannot see the ocean, only the proof of it. Mississippi, autumn, 1944. Thunder stacks over a depot where the ceiling fans push heat nowhere. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham eases his truck to a stop, dust walking off the tires. He wants coffee and a plate of something that remembers a mother's kitchen. Inside the cafe, 3 German POWs sit at the counter, guards behind them, mustard jars bright as flares. Trim steps in, removes his cap, and the waitress, brittle smile, eyes tired, points him to the back door. "Kitchen for you," she says. He studies the sign above the counter that says, "White." The Germans turn to watch. One looks ashamed, another looks relieved. The third looks at his plate. Eddie, passing through with a prisoner draft, pays the tab for his men and catches Trim's glance. 2 soldiers measuring the miles between duties and rights. He would have filed an incident report that night, and likely did. It would have joined others in a stack that moved slower than freight. Outside, rain needles the hood. Inside, the POWs finish their pie. The paradox is not news, but today it burns like cordite. On the platform, a newspaper flaps against a bench. Liberty ships, 2,710 of them now, keep the convoys fat. 1 yard once assembled a hull in 4 days and 15 hours, an impossible statistic that feels like a dare to physics. Another article brags a plant called Willow Run can push a B-24 out the door roughly each hour at peak. Trim folds the paper and thinks how a country that fast can learn faster too. The whistle moans. Eddie lifts 2 fingers in a quiet salute to Trim. Trim returns it, then takes his coffee from the kitchen. "Win the war first," he tells himself, tasting the bitterness and the truth. Then come home and fix the rest. The thunder finally breaks. Kansas elevators, late summer, 1944. The elevator takes the grain like a lung, sighing it upward and rattling breaths until the scale beam kisses level. Chaff lifts and eddies in sunlight. A telegraph on the wall ticks out car numbers like a metronome for victory. Eddie pencils a new rotation on his clipboard. 40 minutes in the shade, 20 at the hopper. Because men, like machines, run longer when you don't grind them. He learned that from a sergeant and from Martha's coffee. The guard truck idles, with the hood up, its fan belt already replaced from the box of spares that rides under the bench seat as naturally as a Bible. Carl hefts sacks on the dock and studies the choreography. He would have expected chaos when the noon freight arrives, but switchmen are already spotted along the spur, couplers kissed, brake wheels set, the conductor's watch agreeing with the dispatcher 10 towns away. What breaks is replaced, what wears is swapped, what slows is rerouted. The system doesn't shout, it anticipates. Martha scribbles figures on a grocery slip, field to vinery, vinery to can to rail, then adds a loaf for Eddie's squad as if logistics and kindness share a ledger line. Down the road, a quartermaster mobile bakery exhales a warm, clean smell that travels like a promise. Trays clatter, dough goes in, bread comes out, and somewhere a field mess will slice it into a taste of home that keeps a rifleman's hands steady. Carl tries to imagine the Reich matching this with ersatz coffee and scrounged tires. He cannot. The elevator boss waves a green flag. The cars ease forward, each swallowed bushel a silent oath. Eddie checks his watch and says, "Next detail." The pencil writes the future into the schedule, one neat line at a time. Horns of dusk sound from the cicadas, and the camp becomes a small town with a fence for a main street. In the recreation barracks, a choir lines up beside a potbelly stove and washes the rafters with a hymn that Carl's grandmother used to hum while darning socks. A corporal from Special Projects rolls in a film projector and threads a reel that would have passed for sorcery in Carl's village. A town meeting, a factory floor, a blackboard full of math that turns steel into wings. He would have called it propaganda if the peaches at noon had not tasted so real. Eddie stands by the door, cap under his arm, and watches how order grows when men have something to do besides stare at wire. Fewer infractions, fewer hands in pockets, more pencils at tables where English words bloom between German syllables. Carl, the teacher says, flattening the vowel, and the room laughs with the kind of gentleness that bruises nothing. In a side room, carved nativity figures cure on a shelf. A guitar gets tuned. Someone writes a letter that will be opened by a censor who's learned to spot code and homesickness by the same slant. Mail call crackles. A boy's handwriting reports coal rationing back home. A mother says she traded stamps for beets. A sister asks if America is as loud as the radio. Carl pockets the letter and looks at the lamp glow on Eddie's face. At the easy way, the man jokes with his own sergeant. Rank worn like a responsibility, not a threat. He would have expected fear to keep a camp quiet. Instead, it's purpose. Lights out approaches. The hymn settles. Beyond the fence, a train horn draws a line under the day. Tomorrow's work already hums in the projector's cooling fan. Camp mess. Early autumn, 1944. After lunch, the mess hall breathes out. Pans hiss and rinse water. Coffee drains from urns with a hollow glug that sounds to Carl like a cathedral emptying. A private tips a bin of crust toward the hog buckets and wipes his hands on a towel, already reaching for bleach. Carl flinches at the heap, bread enough, he thinks, to feed a street, and then catches himself, ashamed of the reflex. Waste here is not greed, it is overflow. The quartermaster ledger can afford it because the railheads can. The railheads can because the mills can. The mills can because the harvest did. Eddie signs a turn-in for dented cans, scribbles a note for more soap, and rides a stake bed to the dump with a detail pulling wire from busted crates. The pile looks like a battlefield's bones, tin, slats, odd screws, only quieter, and it stuns Carl in a way bullets never did. "Where I'm from," he says, half joking, half praying, "we would melt this into an airplane." Eddie almost answers, and doesn't. He remembers a clipping in his pocket. At its peak, Willow Run could push a B-24 off the line roughly every hour, one factory whose daily bomber tonnage would have matched or exceeded what some Axis plants managed in a month. It sounds impossible until you've stood in a room where bread becomes trash. He pockets the clipping again. No need to preach. The facts preach themselves whenever the trash lid claps shut or a mechanic tosses a used belt for a fresh one waiting in a crate. Martha will wrap heel ends for the hogs, not because she must, but because the Depression taught her manners. Carl watches her hands and understands the larger machine. Evening brings the smell of disinfectant and pies cooling on a sill. The guard truck backfires once, then starts clean. Tomorrow will be louder. County Rally, November 1944. The town band warms brass beneath bunting, while a plywood board lists numbers like commandments. Acres cut, cars loaded, boys gone. Steam curls from a mobile bakery truck, and the smell of new bread rolls through the square, stitching home to front line one slice at a time. Eddie stands with his cap folded under his arm as the county agent tallies harvest, hundreds of thousands of bushels up from last year, elevators near bursting, mills on maximum grind. He reads from a bulletin that sounds like prophecy, convoys docking on schedule, depots stocked so deep an infantry division could eat its way across a winter. Martha feels the arithmetic in her hands. The ache that means work met its target. She thinks of each ladle of stew as a rivet. Carl, escorted to the rally with the work detail, studies a poster that collapses a continent into figures. 2,710 Liberty ships built, hulls marching like columns. Aircraft counted not by squadrons, but oceans. Hundreds of thousands over the war. Factories where daylight itself must have punched a clock. He would have said the numbers were theater, if not for the bread in his pocket and the freight roaring nightly past the fence. A pastor prays, voice modest, and a Gold Star mother pins a ribbon to the board that already carries too many names. Eddie hears the quiet ripple of attention and feels the ledger balance. Abundance doesn't erase the cost. It pays the invoice on time, in full. Trim, passing through in a convoy, lingers at the back and nods to the bakery smoke as if it salutes him. When the band strikes America, the crowd sings. Carl does not know the words, but recognizes the cadence. The plywood board creaks, heavy with totals and memory, and the square smells like yeast and November. Winter, 1945 to 46. Frost silvers the ruts to the camp gate, and truck exhaust draws white commas in the morning air. Men shoulder duffels heavier with paper than with clothes, carved nativity scenes, English primers, folded sketches of kitchens and windmills. Orders crackle, transport to railhead, rail to port, berths as available. The war is over, but ships still run their math. Some will wait months. Eddie checks a final roll, and for the first time calls men by names he knows he will not say again. Routine holds. Count, load, secure. Rituals that kept the towers quiet and the days productive. Martha brings a wrapped parcel to Carl, a recipe card for stew, a small book of psalms, 2 heel ends for the road, because the depression would have insisted. "For your mother," she says, and Carl bows as if the gesture were rank. He would have tried to say how the kitchen changed the map in his head. Instead, he hands her a pencil drawing of the table, plate, cup, folded napkin like a flag at rest. Trim rolls past in a demobilization convoy, eyes on a flyer for a meeting he would have joined if the schedule allowed. He thinks of the lunch counter and the long work ahead, yet the convoy's speed feels like promise. A nation that built airfields and cornfields can pour concrete for justice. He would have told Eddie that someday they'd wear the same doorways, like they wore the same uniform. At the siding, a steam whistle lifts into blue winter. Carl turns once to see the towers small in the distance, the windmill ticking like a metronome for memory. Eddie raises 2 fingers from his cap. Martha presses a glove to her mouth. The trucks shift, then go. The frost holds the ruts until noon. Years later. A museum case holds small things that outweigh tanks. A POW carved crib figure, a napkin folded to a sharp square, a snapshot of a summer table with guards in the doorway, and women pouring coffee as if it were doctrine. Carl, now gray at the temples, reads the placard to his grandchildren, careful with dates. Aliceville, June 2nd, 1943. Kansas, summer, 1944. Repatriation through 1946. He says the Americans fought with rifles that reloaded themselves and with factories that turned hours into airplanes. He does not say propaganda, he says proof. A docent recites the statistics that still sound impossible. 1 yard once assembled a Liberty ship in 4 days, 15 hours. At peak, Willow Run could push a B-24 roughly each hour. Across the war, the United States produced on the order of 300,000 aircraft and 2,710 ocean-going cargo ships, numbers that bury arguments the way snow buries a fence. A sidebar notes the POW death rate under 1% in U.S. custody, a moral ledger that ended up shaping peacetime more than it planned. Martha, older, runs a finger along the photo glass until it comes to rest on the cup she remembers drying, the one that never quite lost the smell of strong coffee. Eddie, beside her, says nothing and everything with a breath. Trim, quoted on another wall, reminds visitors that victory abroad demanded courage at home. The same logistics that fed armies would later feed movements. The docent asks what surprised them most. The napkin, Carl answers, and the children laugh, then go quiet. Because a great power could afford to be gentle, he adds, and that is what defeated us. Outside, a freight horn draws a familiar line through the day, and the case glass reflects